I'm sitting here on a park bench next to the Nashua River in a park that was dedicated in May of 2001 to honor the French-Canadian or Franco-American presence in Nashua from the time the first immigrants began arriving here to work in the mills. We're about a block off of Main Street in downtown Nashua. There's a statue here that also indicates the French-Canadian presence that we'll take a look at in just a minute. Now, there's nothing in this park that is specific to Jack Kerouac, who grew up in Lowell. But in a larger sense, it does show the Franco-American or French-Canadian experience, the ambience that Kerouac grew up in Lowell, and that shaped his writing and his literary consciousness. Let's go over and take a look at the statue that is a part of this park. Now we're standing next to the statue I just mentioned in what is called Le Parc de Notre Renaissance Française. I don't know how good my French is with that, but it basically means the park of our new Renaissance for France, or for the French-Canadian families. Behind me is the statue, which indicates or illustrates the Franco-American experience. As you'll see, it shows a woman standing there, and she's got a spindle in her pocket, indicating that she works in the mills. She's got her hand on her shoulder of her son, who, as you can see, is reading a book. This is the idea that the immigrants would come here, they would work in the mills, they would work hard, they would educate their children so that they in turn could grow up and find a new life here in America. So this statue, as I say, indicates the French-Canadian or Franco-American experience. It is certainly part of what happened with Jack Kerouac. His parents were Quebec immigrants. They came here. He grew up in Lowell, learning both French and English as his languages, and that was what shaped, I say, his literary consciousness. So while this statue behind me is not specific to Kerouac, it does indicate the experience that he had in his early days here in America as he grew up in a home with French-Canadian immigrant parents. Just behind the statue is what used to be the Nashua Manufacturing Company, the mills, where a number of the French-Canadian immigrants would work. And so we have the statue here, the woman working in the mills, educating her son, and with the mills themselves in the background behind it. We're at number 16 Pierce Street. This is where the Kerouac family story of Nashua begins. In 1890, Jack's grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Kerouac, and his wife, Clementine Bernier Kerouac, moved from a little village up in Quebec called Saint-Hubert, and they came here to Nashua. The family they brought with them consisted of these folks. Their children, Emma, who was age 19, Clara, age 14, Louise, age 13, Joseph, age 9, Bernadette, age 8, Ernest, age 5, Anna, age 4, Jean-Baptiste Jr. was age 3, and little baby Leo was age 1. They had one other daughter named Caroline who stayed behind in Quebec to become a nun. Clementine gave birth to 3 more children after they arrived here, and then a very strong tragedy hit this house during the 1890s. Death due to a cholera epidemic that came through at that time took the lives of several children. 2 other of the children who came from Quebec also died. Anna at age 6 of tubercular meningitis, and 14-year-old Bernadette, of which her death record called general dropsy. So you had 3 children that she gave birth to who died of cholera before their first birthday, along with 2 of the children that came down with them from Quebec. 5 children died in this home during the 1890s. 3 of whom before they reached their first birthday, and then 2 of the other daughters who came down with them from Quebec. A really huge tragedy, certainly, for all the people, all the family who was living here. Jean-Baptiste Kerouac died in 1906, which means Jack never met him because Jack wasn't born until 1922. And yet the stories of his grandfather must have been legend in the family because Jack would write about it. This is a passage in Vanity of Douloureuse where he writes about his grandfather, Jean-Baptiste, who must have been quite a character, if this passage indicates. I am the descendant of Jean-Baptiste Lebris de Douloureuse, an old gaffer carpenter from Saint-Hubert and Temiscouata County, Quebec, who built his own house in Nashua, New Hampshire, and used to curse at God, swinging his kerosene lamp during thunderstorms, yelling, "Vague, whap, frappe, hit, vas-y, go ahead, and don't give me no back talk." And when women hit upon him in the street, he told them where to get off, with their bustles and bounces and desires for bracelets he did. The Douloureuse family has always been enraged. Is that a sign of bad blood? Douloureuse is the name Kerouac uses for his family name of Kerouac in a lot of his Lowell novels. So it sounds like, Jean-Baptiste was the stuff of legend in his family. Jack also uses this same passage about him shaking his lantern during a thunderstorm in an essay he wrote after the publication of On the Road called The Origins of the Beat Generation, He said, it goes back to my grandfather. And then he repeats that same passage about him standing out in the storm, shaking his lantern and daring God to strike him dead. So maybe the Beat generation actually had its beginnings right here on Pierce Street in Nashua, New Hampshire. I just find it fascinating that Jack writes about his grandfather as if he knew him. Like I said, although his grandfather had died, do the quick math here, in 1906, and Jack was born in 1922, so he was gone for quite a while. But there are places in Jack's writings where he writes with a certain familiarity about his grandfather. This is what he writes about being on Desolation Peak. This is in Desolation Angels, where he's writing about his experience as a fire lookout on Washington State's Desolation Peak up on the northern Cascades in the summer of 1956. He says, I go out to fetch a pail of snow to put in my old tin wash tub that reminds me of my grandfather's in Nashua, and I find my shovel has disappeared from the snowbank in the precipice. So he's talking about how something reminds him of his grandfather in Nashua. I'm wondering if when he took his family visits here, perhaps they drove by this house for whoever was living there then and told Jack that this was where his grandfather had lived. That may well have happened, but as we've already noted, he never really knew his grandfather firsthand. The other thing I think about is, with all the references to tragedy and the transiency of life, Jack never mentions anything about those 5 kids who died in this house in the 1890s. Although his father and his uncles and his aunts were living here in the house, they knew it happened. Surely it must have been talked about at some point in their family growing up, and yet Jack never writes about it. I do wonder, did Jack ever even hear about it or not? Or was there just kind of a code of silence that we're not going to talk about those 5 kids who died there at number 16 Pierce Street? It could have just been one of those things we don't talk about in our family. That's my guess, anyway. As to what happened to the others who grew up here, Emma, the oldest, was the first to marry. She and her husband lived in Lowell and then moved to Lewiston, Maine. As we go forward in this tour, we'll see the places where Louise and Joseph and Ernest lived here in Nashua as adults. Jean-Baptiste Jr. and his wife, Rosanna Dumais, were Jack's godparents when Jack was baptized in Lowell in 1922. But Jean-Baptiste Jr. lived most of his life up in Manchester, New Hampshire, so there's no traces of him here. So this gets us going on the story of the family of Nashua. We'll be seeing other places where they lived as we go forward. We've moved up to Main Street in Nashua now. I'm still right next to the Nashua River. About a mile or so to the east of here, the Nashua River flows into the Merrimack River, which goes right down to Jack Kerouac's hometown of Lowell. I'm also sitting between what were 2 French-Canadian enclaves in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Just behind me, where the Nashua Manufacturing Company is an area that came to be called French Village here in Nashua. In other communities around New England where French Canadians were settling were sometimes referred to as Little Canada. For reasons not completely clear to me, that area here in Nashua was called French Village. So French Village was the original French Canadian, as I say, enclave, probably around the middle of the 19th century. Sort of the next generation of some of the French Canadian immigrants moved up to a section I'm looking straight ahead at up there. We'll be up there in a little bit. It was called French Hill. This was where one of Jack Kerouac's uncles lives, and we'll see a little bit later. There's a couple of Kerouac sites we can see from here on Main Street. Directly across the street from me, I'm looking right at it, is the building that used to house the offices of the Nashua Telegraph. That's Nashua's newspaper. This was where Leo Kerouac, as a young man growing up here in Nashua, was an apprentice, and he learned his trade there as a printer and doing other kinds of jobs that were associated with putting out a newspaper. He would later put these skills to work when he became the manager and the operator of a French language newspaper called L'Impartial. We'll see that place in just a little bit as well. Just a couple of blocks up Main Street, I can just barely see it from here, there's a building that says 100 Main Street on it. This was where one of Jack Kerouac's aunts lived. Her name was Mary Louise Kerouac-Michaud. She was married for a brief time, actually, to a gentleman whose last name was Michaud. Jack was quite taken with her. He referred to her as his father's favorite aunt. And she comes up in a passage in Visions of Gerard, where Jack writes about how she has come down to Lowell to help take care of the family while his father is ill, and how she takes a special love for Gerard, who, as all people who read Kerouac know, Gerard died of rheumatic fever when he was 9 years old and Jack was 4. Jack would later write about that when he was in his early 30s in the book Visions of Gerard. Here's how he describes his Aunt Louise. He calls her Aunt Marie in here. Aunt Marie has him, that's Gerard, by the hand. She's visiting us for a week, and she wants to take a morning constitutional and take deep breaths and show Gerard how to do likewise for his health. Aunt Marie is my father's favorite sister and my favorite aunt, a talkative, open-hearted, teary, bleary lovely, with red lipstick always and gushy kisses and a black ribbon pendant from her specs. While my father has been in bed with rheumatism, she's helped out somewhat with the housework. Crippled, on crutches, a modiste. Never married, but many boyfriends helped her. The spitting image of Emil, Emil is Jack's name for his father, Leo, the spitting image of Emil and the lover of Gerard's little soul as no one else, unless it be the cold-eyed but warm-hearted Aunt Marie from up in Maine. Tease Gerard, for your health, always do this. Take big clacks of air in your lungs, hold it in a long time. Look, pounding her first piece breast, see? Oui, ma tante Marie. Do you love your ma tante? My ma tante Marie, I love her so bad, he cries affectionately as they hug and limp around the corner to the school. It's interesting to read that passage in terms of some of the things I came to learn about Jack's Aunt Louise. You'll notice in that passage he says, crippled on crutches, a modiste. A modiste, that's a French term for a dressmaker or a seamstress. The reason he says she was crippled on crutches was because at a very young age, as she was crossing a street here in Nashua, she was hit by a street car and it damaged her legs. Given what medical assistance or help was available to her then, she wasn't able to have it set properly, and so she was crippled for the rest of her life. That's why he says crippled on crutches, a modiste. And if you look at that building up there at 100 Main Street, she probably lived upon about the second or third floor. There were no elevators. She just had to work her way up and down those stairs every time she came and gone from where she was living here. Also interesting that Jack said she was never married. As I just said, she was actually married for a brief time to a gentleman named Philippe Michaud, about whom I was able to learn very little, actually. But I was also taken by that phrase where he says, never married, but many boyfriends helped her. One of the people I was able to talk to as I was doing my research on the Kerouac presence in Nashua and my book, Kerouac's Nashua Connection, was one of Jack's first cousins who was still living at the time. His name was Armin Kerouac. And when I asked Armin about this passage, I said, Armin, what does your cousin Jack mean when he says that Aunt Marie had many boyfriends? And Armin, who was kind of a gruff sort of a guy, he sat there and he grinned and he said, well, let's just say my Aunt Louise was ahead of her time. Now we're in downtown Nashua, in front of number 23 Elm Street, in front of what looks like a consignment shop. But for quite a number of years, from the early 1900s up until 1963, this building housed the operations of a French-language newspaper called L'Impartial. And after he completed his apprenticeship with the Nashua Telegraph, Leo Kerouac came here to be the manager, the operator of L'Impartial, put out the newspaper for the French community, which was just a few blocks from where we are here in French Village. The real significance of this place when it comes to the Kerouac story and Jack Kerouac's Lowell is that this newspaper, L'Impartial, was owned by a gentleman named Louis Biron. Mr. Biron, in 1912, bought a French-language newspaper in Lowell called L'Étoile. L'Étoile is French for the star. I think he meant that as a counterpoint to the English-language newspaper in Lowell, The Sun. Well, Mr. Biron must have been impressed with the job that Leo Kerouac was doing here, because after he bought L'Étoile, he asked Leo if he would consider moving down to Lowell to run that paper. And Leo agreed to do that. So somewhere in around 1912, 1913, somewhere in there, Leo Kerouac moved to Lowell. As far as I know, he was the first Kerouac to move to Lowell. All the rest of them were still living up here in Nashua. Now at that time, Leo had already met the woman who would become his wife, Gabrielle Levesque, so he would have to come back up here to Nashua to court her. But that was where he lived from about 1912, 1913 on to run the French-language newspaper L'Étoile. Now I sometimes wonder how it would have been if Leo had stayed here. Remember, he'd already met his future wife, Gabrielle, at that time. What if he had stayed here in Nashua and raised his family? Then maybe it would have been Nashua, New Hampshire that would have shaped Jack Kerouac's literary consciousness instead of Lowell, Massachusetts. We can only speculate on that. All of that to say that this is the place from which Leo Kerouac was launched to live in Lowell, which is why Jack Kerouac was born in Lowell, Massachusetts. We're now at 101 Ash Street in what was Nashua's French Village. This area is now generally referred to as the Tree Streets, since most of the streets here have the names of trees, like ash or pine or chestnut or palm. Behind me is the boarding house where Gabrielle Levesque lived. We're shifting to the Levesque side of the family now for a moment. Gabrielle Levesque, Jack's mother, she moved here when she was about 15, 16, probably 17 years old, somewhere in there, to get away from a very difficult family situation. And after she got a job working in a shoe factory here in Nashua, she was living here when she married Leo Kerouac at the age of 20. Her story was a rather interesting one. Her father was Louis Levesque, who owned a tavern here in Nashua. Gabrielle was actually born up in Quebec in St. Pacôme. Her mother, Josephine Jean Levesque, became pregnant here in Nashua, but she went up to her family home in St. Pacôme, Quebec, to have her babies. Turned out to be she had twins, at least according to Jack. When Gabrielle was only about a year old, her mother, Josephine, died in childbirth, so she never knew her birth mother. Her father, Louis Levesque, remarried a few years later, and so his second wife was the person that Gabrielle knew as her mother growing up. Then when Gabrielle was 16, her father died very suddenly of a heart attack, just dropped dead here on a Nashua street, Louis Levesque. So that was when she was feeling a little at loose ends, as you can probably imagine. It's a long story, what I can't get into here, but as I said, she had a very difficult family life, and so this was where she came to live on her own when she was around 16, 17 years old, shortly after her father had died, and as I said, she went to work in a shoe factory. I'm not exactly sure how she and Leo met. By the time they began courting, Leo had already moved down to Lowell to run the French language newspaper down there, L'Étoile. But Leo must have come up here to court her. When I stand here, I try to imagine Leo coming up the street here to meet her and go out for the evening. So this was where Gabrielle lived. Now Jack writes about her in some very interesting kinds of ways. He refers to her as an orphan, which I guess in a way is technically correct, but she wasn't an orphan in the way we generally think about orphans as being young children who have lost both of their parents. She had her birth father until she was 16 years old, and then she had some connection with the woman that Louis had married after Gabrielle's mother had died. But Jack writes about her in Desolation Angels. I'm going to read just a few passages from there. As for my mother, there was no other in the world, really. There was no other like her in the world, really. Did she bear me just to have a little child to bless her heart? She got her wish. She was a neat French-Canadian, born in St. Pacôme in 1895, while her pregnant mother was visiting Canada from New Hampshire. She was born a twin, but the gleeful, fleshy little twin died. Oh, what would she have been like? So apparently, Gabrielle would have had a twin sibling, except she died in childbirth. And then Jack adds to the end, in that same sentence, he says, and the mother died too. He makes it sound there as if she had died giving birth to Gabrielle and the twin, but she actually didn't die until about a year later. At another place in Desolation Angels, Jack also refers to his mother, writing about the difficult time she had here in Nashua. He writes, her sewing basket contains a wooden darner, like a small bowling duck pin, older than I am. Her needles, some of them come from Nashua, 1910. As the years go by, her family write her increasingly loving letters, realizing what they lost when they took her orphan money and spent it. I'm not exactly sure what Jack's referring to there. He's obviously picking up on stories that his mother told him about the difficult family life that she had here in Nashua. But as I say, this was where she came to live after her father had passed away. This was where she was living when she and Leo Levesque were married at the St. Louis de Gonzague Church. They immediately moved to begin raising their family, which included their 3 children, Caroline, Gerard, and Jack. We're now in the heart of the original French-Canadian community in Nashua, referred to as French Village. This is where the French-Canadian immigrants began to settle shortly after the Civil War, as they say, to work in the mills here. We're on the site, 48 Hollis Street, of the St. Louis de Gonzague Church. The St. Louis Church was built for the French-Canadians who were settling here. It was called a national parish, meant it was open to persons of French-Canadian descent, not so much a geographical parish for people in a certain area, although it actually served both purposes. This was the spiritual home, the spiritual anchor for the French-Canadian community here, and that certainly included the Kerouac family. Leo and Gabrielle Kerouac were married here in October of 1915, as were many of Leo's other siblings. Now, the place where we are standing here is not the original structure. Unfortunately, the original St. Louis was destroyed by fire in 1976. So this is the building that was erected afterwards. Just straight ahead of me where I'm looking right now was left of the original structure. So as I said, this was kind of the spiritual heart and soul of the French-Canadian community. It is, as I mentioned, where Jack's parents were married. This was also the site of the funeral of Jack's father, Leo Kerouac, when he died in May of 1946. He was taken from here to the St. Louis Cemetery, which will be the last stop on our tour. Much more recently, on June 5th of 1997, a memorial mass here was held for Jack Kerouac's daughter, Jan Michelle Kerouac. She had died 1 year earlier in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That's a longer backstory that I can really get into here, other than it was a very sad situation for her. She was Jack's daughter. They only had 2 very brief encounters during Jan's entire life. She became befriended by some of the French-Canadian Kerouacs who lived up in Quebec, and they were the ones who kind of took her under their wing. So when she passed away, it was the founder of an organization called the Kerouac Family Association that arranged for a memorial mass to be held here for Jan Kerouac on the 1st anniversary of her death. I was very honored to attend that and go to the cemetery where her ashes were interred in the Kerouac plot. So as I noted, this was a very important part of the whole French-Canadian experience, the St. Louis de Gonzague Church here at 48 Hollis Street. We're standing in the parking lot of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashua. This is a congregation that I served for 24 years before I retired from it in 2012. Coming to this church was what brought me to Nashua and sort of got me into the Kerouac orbit down there in Lowell as well. We're right on the edge, right in the corner of what I referred to a few minutes ago as French Hill. This was the second French-Canadian enclave that opened up in Nashua toward the latter part of the 19th century. And it was just around the corner from here, where we'll be going in just a few minutes, is where Jack's uncle Joseph Kerouac lived. Armin Kerouac was one of Joseph's children, which made him Jack's first cousin. As I said, Armin was someone I was able to interview when I was researching my book, Kerouac's Nashua Connection. Armin has since passed away. But I asked him if he could remember times when they were living here in French Hill, if Jack and Caroline and Gerard and Jack's parents, Leo and Gabrielle, would come up here to Nashua for visits. And Armin said, yes, they would come up and see us from time to time. And I said, well, Armin, do you remember, you know, there's that cemetery right behind the Unitarian Church, which is about a block away from the home where you grew up. And Armin says, oh, yes, I remember that cemetery. And I said, well, did you and Jack and Caroline and Gerard ever go and play around the gravestones in there? And Armin said, yeah, that was one of the things we did. We would go down to the cemetery and walk around and play around among the gravestones. And I thought, well, how about that? I've got a Kerouac site right here on the church I'm serving. Now, where I'm standing, I'm looking into the room that was my office for the 24 years that I was here. And so every once in a while, I would look up for whatever I was attending to in my office, glance across the parking lot to the cemetery behind me, and try to imagine what it was like for little Jack, his older brother Gerard before he got rheumatic fever, and his older sister Caroline, and his uncle Armin to be walking around in the cemetery. I tried to picture that. And like I said, from time to time, that would just give me a way of looking up and thinking about Jack and his early years and how part of his coming up to Nashua helped shape him in his growing up days. Continuing on here in the French Hill section of Nashua, I am at number 23 Cross Street. The house behind me is the one where Jack's uncle Joseph Kerouac lived for a number of years with his wife Leontine and their children, one of whom, as I already mentioned, was Armin Kerouac, who was a source for my Kerouac's Nashua Connection book. Joseph Kerouac, one of the children of Jean-Baptiste and Clementine Kerouac, married a woman named Leontine Rouleau. They moved up here to French Hill and he opened up a grocery store just around the corner from where we are here. It's a vacant lot now. It was called the Rouleau and Kerouac Grocery Store. Uncle Joseph made quite an impression upon Jack. He writes about him in both of his novels, Visions of Gerard and in Dr. Sachs, and he calls him his Uncle Mike. It sounds like Uncle Mike was a rather sad figure in many ways. He was a lifelong asthmatic. When I asked Armin about his father, Armin said, I don't think my father ever drew a clear, clean breath throughout his whole life. So I'm going to read just a couple passages, one from Dr. Sachs and one from Visions of Gerard, where Jack writes about him. He says it was Uncle Joseph, whom, as I say, he calls Uncle Mike. He was an extremely intelligent man, remembered whole spates of history, talked at great length with his melancholy, rasping breath about the beauties of the poetry of Victor Hugo. Amo, his brother, always extolled the novels of Victor Hugo. Poet Mike was the saddest doulos in the world. That is very sad. I saw him cry countless times. Well, what happened to Joseph, or Uncle Mike as Jack called him, was he eventually lost his store here in Nashua during the Depression. This was where the French Canadians were living. They would come to his store to buy the food they needed. He would extend them credit because he didn't want them to go hungry, but then they were never able to pay him back, which meant he couldn't order the more food and the other goods that he needed to keep his store going. I remember Armand telling me how his father would send him out around the neighborhood here to see if he could collect from the people who owed him the money, and they just couldn't pay him. So eventually, since he was not able to have the money to order what he needed to keep his store going, Joseph had to close his store, and he moved down to Lowell to be with his Kerouac relatives down there. Well, Jack writes about his Uncle Joseph's store in his book, Dr. Sachs. In the passage I'm going to read from here, he talks about how he and his mother had gone over to visit his Uncle Joseph and his family one evening. This is after they had moved to Lowell, after Joseph had lost his store. And Jack is talking to his mother about how he's very uncomfortable in his Uncle Joseph's home because it's always kind of dark and gloomy there. And his mother is trying to explain some things to him. And she says, Aunt Clementine, that's Leontine Rouleau, Aunt Clementine has suffered all this many years trying to keep ends together. With your uncle sick and lost his grocery store, remember the big barrels of pickles in his grocery store in Nashua, the sawdust, the meat, what with having to bring up Edgar and Blanche and Roland and Viola. In other words, she's telling him what a hard life his Uncle Joseph, or Uncle Mike as he calls him, has had. And Jack, that must have made an impression on him because he remembered it when he wrote his novel, Dr. Sachs. So as I said, the site of the Rouleau and Kerouac grocery store is no longer there. It's actually a parking lot just around the corner from where I'm standing. And then just further up the street, up Whitney Street, is what used to be the St. Francis Xavier Church. It was the Catholic church built for the French Canadian immigrants as they settled up here in this part of Nashua. The architecture is very similar to that of some of the churches in the towns and villages up in Quebec. So I think it was built to remind the French Canadian immigrants here of their home country. So it's no longer the St. Francis Xavier Church. It's being occupied by another faith community now, but the architecture is still there as a reminder of how this once was a very strong French Canadian neighborhood. I'm standing now in front of number 27 Gilman Street, which is right out on the edge of Nashua's French Village. This is where Jack's Uncle Ernest lived with his wife Alice for most of their lives until Ernest passed away in 1954. Jack refers to Ernest Kerouac as Uncle Vincent in Vanity of Doulos. I'll share the passage about Uncle Vincent when we get to the St. Louis Cemetery, which will be our next and final stop after we are here. This was the place where the Kerouac family gathered in 1946 when Leo Kerouac died in May of that year. By that time they had moved to New York. They were living in Queens, but when Leo died at the age of 57, he was to be buried in the Kerouac family plot here. So the family, Jack, his mother, other Kerouacs and Leveques all came here for Leo's funeral. They gathered here at his Uncle Ernest's home following the funeral, and then Jack went back to New York. So there's a passage in there about that gathering and about Jack's take on his Uncle Vincent, the person he calls Uncle Vincent, really Uncle Ernest. And I'll share that with you when we get to the St. Louis Cemetery, which is our next and final stop on this tour. This is the final stop on our Kerouac Nashua tour. We're at the St. Louis de Gonzague Cemetery, which was opened in 1880, just as I said that the French Canadians were beginning to arrive. I should have mentioned this back at the church, but the alternate name for the St. Louis Cemetery is St. Aloysius. St. Aloysius is the patron saint of Catholic youth. He was born Luigi Gonzaga, and so the names St. Louis Gonzague and St. Aloysius are kind of used interchangeably in referring to the church. So we're here at the site where three of Jack Kerouac's novels end, right here. Visions of Gerard, The Town and the City, and The Vanity of Doulos. Buried here are Jack's brother Gerard, his parents Leo and Gabrielle Kerouac, and as I'll say a little bit more in just a minute or two, the ashes of his daughter Jean-Michel are also interred here. There are 4 Kerouac sites in this cemetery, the one we're standing by, 3 others. There is a marker over to my left a little ways for Jean-Baptiste Kerouac and his wife Rosanna Dumais. Jean-Baptiste, Jack's godfather, as we mentioned earlier, is not really buried there. His wife Rosanna, who is Jack's godmother, she died After she died, Jean-Baptiste remarried to a woman in Manchester, and he's buried in a cemetery in Manchester. So even though his name is on a marker here, this is not his burial site. Over to my right, against the fence where we came in, is where Ernest Kerouac is buried, the Uncle Vincent in Vanity of Dulowos. I'll read that passage in just a minute. And then up on a little rise back up that way is the marker for Joseph Kerouac, Jack's Uncle Mike. And so when the Kerouacs first arrived here, Jean-Baptiste purchased those 4 plots, and these are where the family members are buried. There's no marker here for Jack's grandfather and his grandmother, Jean-Baptiste Kerouac and Clementine Bernier Kerouac. I can only assume that they are also buried somewhere on this site, but as I say, there is no marker for them. I'm going to read the concluding passages in 3 of Jack Kerouac's novels that are located here on this site. As I mentioned, they are Visions of Girard, Vanity of Dulowos, and The Town and the City. I'm going to start with Visions of Girard. As we've already said earlier, Girard was Jack's older brother who died of rheumatic fever when he was 9 and Jack was 4, and Jack would memorialize his brother in his book, Visions of Girard. So Visions of Girard concludes with Girard's funeral being held at the St. Louis de France Church in Lowell, and then he is brought up here to the Kerouac family plot for burial. Here's how Jack writes about it. He's thinking back now to when he was 4 years old. We all get in cars, and they slowly weave the parade, and out we go on a long, slow drive along the Merrimack River by sodden trees with all their foliage looking sad, to the bridge at Tingsboro and across that to Nashua, entering that little city my parents come from town, in bleak array, to the cemetery outside town, where I remember the long gray wall and the glistening boulevard in the rain, and they haul the coffin gently down to grave ropes that for all their gentle look have no gentle job to do, and lower away, easy does it, the little hunk of pain into the mud. Men stand around, my father in the midst of them, bareheaded with that gloopy helplessness beneath immense and endless skies that say "Yah" down upon the entire scene. My father's curly hair is moist and uncombed, and the lids of his eyes are down where they'll always be. A cold place to kneel this earth, and he'll kneel again. It's a cold place for knees. Ma and T. Nin, that's his sister Caroline, Ma and T. Nin, sitting with me in a black car, burst out sobbing as the coffin downward disappears. I turn to them and say, "Well, why are you crying?" T. Jean, you don't understand. You're too young to understand. They wail, seeing my rosy face, my questioning eyes. I look again. The men have stepped a pace aback, expectant. Old gravedigger picks up his shovel and closes the book. That's the note upon which Visions of Girard ends. And now I want to show how Jack Kerouac ends 2 novels, the first one and the last one that he published during his lifetime. There are many other books of his that have come out posthumously, but the first book Jack published in his lifetime was The Town and the City. The last one that he published was The Vanity of Dulowos. They both end on this spot, and they both describe the same event, which is the burial of Jack's father, Leo Kerouac, in May of 1946. I want you to take a look at how different the 2 passages are. Remember, Jack wrote The Town and the City when he was a young man with his career, his literary career, or his hopes for a literary career ahead of him, and he's writing about bringing his father back up here for burial. In Town and the City, he calls his father, Leo, George Martin. He calls Nashua, Lacoshua. Here's how he writes it. They buried George Martin in New Hampshire on a long grassy slope off the foot of a hill in the middle of the farming country around Lacoshua. It was a small cemetery, over 100 years old, with old stones leaning woefully among the waving grass, others fallen and half buried in the loam, the husks of ancient wreaths mingling with pine cones, wildflowers, and a stone wall that became a vine in the wild undergrowths of the earth. A great grove of old pines surround this burial ground, bending it over shaggily on 3 sides. On this hill in the distance, one saw the misty lands and farm fields and pine woods of old New Hampshire earth, from which the Martins of 2 centuries had risen. A very pastoral kind of a place that he writes about. And George Martin is coming home to be buried in the place of his ancestors. Now, in truth, Leo Kerouac was born in 1899, just before his family came to Lowell, so there had been no long ancestry. Jack's taking some literary license there. But I want you to compare that to how he writes about the same instance in Vanity of Doulouos. This is the last novel that he published 20 years later. He's had a very difficult life in some ways. He's managed to get his works published, but he's also had his battles with alcoholism. He's going to die about a year after he publishes this. Same passage. Bringing Leo from New York up here to be buried. So the undertakers come and dump him in a basket, and we have him hearsed up to the cemetery in New Hampshire, in the town where he was born, and little idiot birds are singing on the branch. At one point, the blue jay mother throws the weakling out of the nest, and he falls to the foot of the tree and thrashes there, dying and starving. A priest tries to console me. So we go from this very pastoral setting of George Martin being brought home to be laid to rest in the area of his ancestors to this very harsh, almost angry kind of a way that Jack is writing about the same instance not too long before he dies. The blue jay mother throws the weakling out of the nest, thrashes there, dying and starving. A priest tries to console me. And then he writes about his Uncle Ernest, whom he calls Uncle Vincent here, the home that we just saw before we got here. He says, I walk with my Uncle Vincent Doulouos after the funeral through the little streets of Nashua, and understand from his silence why he was always considered the mean and uncommunicative Doulouos. He was the honest one. He said, your father was a good boy, but he was too ambitious and proud and crazy. I guess you're the same. I don't know. Well, in between. I never disliked Emil or Leo, but there you have it, and him. And I'm dying myself, and you'll die someday, and all this, poof, it goes. He made a Breton Gallic shrug at the empty blue sky above. Of Uncle Vincent, you could not say he was a victim of the vanity of Doulouos. The vanity of Doulouos, as Jack Kerouac saw it, was kind of striving to reach beyond your station in life, feeling you were destined for better things. And he's saying of his Uncle Ernest, whom he calls Vincent here, he was the one who was willing and able and ready to just kind of settle for his lot in life. That's what he means when he says, you can't say my Uncle Vincent was the victim of the vanity of Doulouos. One more burial I need to mention. It's right here at my feet. Just a little ways down from the ground is an urn or a box where the ashes of Jack's daughter, Jean-Michel Kerouac, is also laid to rest. I spoke about this back at the St. Louis Church. I don't feel the need to elaborate too much on it here, other than to say that her life was also a tragic one. She died at age 44 of kidney failure when she was unable to get a transplant. She was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the time. She'd lived something of a vagabond life. As I mentioned back at the church, she was befriended by some of the people who made up the Kerouac Family Association in Quebec. They came down here for her memorial mass. By the time Janet passed away, she'd become embroiled with the Kerouac estate in Lowell as to who had the legal rights to what. I don't see a whole lot of need to get into that now, other than to say that I was here when she was laid to rest, and I mourned her death as Jack's only offspring. Well, this concludes the tour of the Kerouac sites of Nashua. I hope it has helped to expand some of your knowledge and understanding of Jack Kerouac. But he was not only of Lowell. Lowell is what shaped his life. Lowell is what shaped his literary consciousness. Lowell was what gave him his identity. But there's a very important backstory to the life of Jack Kerouac that took place here in Nashua, New Hampshire. Thank you for being a part of this.